I did. I think so. How are we putting everybody up on stage and make a...
We'll have at the last talk, the announcement 5 minute break, which will allow them to get chairs up there and call everyone up. Yeah, I did.
Oh, yeah, just start.
John. Okay, I'm going to go start yelling. I just want to say, you get to go to Venice. After dinner with you. Well, it all happened, I know. Yeah. I'm glad I did it. We talk about it later. Tomorrow. We need to hang out after. Okay. Once then we should just hang out. Yeah. You're sitting here. You're sitting here.
standing here, sitting down. We're going to get started with our afternoon session. Okay, we'll be kicking off with a talk by Frederick Ilchman. Frederick is the Mrs. Russell W. Baker Curator of Paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. He holds degrees in art history from Princeton and Columbia Universities and came to the MFA in 2001 as assistant curator of paintings. He helped plan the major exhibition on Jacopo Tintoretto at the Museo del Prado in the spring of 2007 and was a contributor to its catalog. And he also served as the lead curator for the exhibition Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, Rivals in Renaissance Venice in 2009, jointly organized between the MFA and the Louvre. Frederick was also my co-curator on the exhibition that this symposium celebrates, Veronese, a master in his workshop in Renaissance Venice. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome Frederick today.
Excuse me, thank you. My topic is how Paolo Veronese told religious stories, how he arranged compositions, reinforced narrative and theological points, and applied oil paint to canvas. What is distinctive about his religious narrative pictures becomes clearer when Veronese is compared to his older rivals, above all Titian and Tintoretto. Such comparisons will help disprove Veronese's lingering reputation as not committed to religious art. An assessment summed up by Michael Levy, who wrote in 1960, "There is little doubt that religious subjects presented a problem to him, as they did not either to Titian or Tintoretto." For centuries, Veronese has been wrongly dismissed as supremely talented but without much depth, a John Singer Sargent of the 16th century, perhaps. I will dispute this characterization, yet at the same time contend that the artist's very attentiveness to surface enhances the profundity of his art. My arguments are based upon observations in the Veronese literature, particularly by David Rosand, as well as contributors to the Ringling's exhibition catalog, especially Virginia Brilliant. I will insist that Veronese is a paradoxical painter and that the apparent contradictions in his art are essential to understanding his achievement in the most important part of his output, his religious narrative paintings. The English artist Sir Joshua Reynolds was famously skeptical of the seriousness of Venetian painters. In 1771, Reynolds surely had Veronese in mind when he condemned the tendency by Venetian painters to flaunt technical proficiency. In Reynolds' words, Venetian artists, quote, "painted with no other purpose than to be admired for their skill and expertness in the mechanism of painting." In front of the Martyrdom and Last Communion of St. Lucy in the exhibition, it is hard to take seriously that Veronese was a shallow artist, concerned merely with surface elegance. To be sure, the shimmering fabrics, the warm pastel palette, and gracefully posed figures delight the eye. The figures are arranged close to the viewer, right up against the picture plane, on a sort of shallow stage. The classical architecture in the distance reads like a theatrical backdrop, seemingly not connected to the foreground action. Even the low viewpoint, with little of the pavement visible, reinforces the painting's surface presence. Yet this first impression of sheer beauty isn't the whole story. Veronese meticulously considered the individual poses, gestures, and juxtapositions. Lucy kneels gracefully, her eyes and mouth just inches away from her goal, which is the communion wafer offered by the venerable priest. Her left hand touches her chest in a sign of sincerity, while she extends her right arm, her palm parallel to the picture plane, which we might call the Veronese hand, acknowledging her humility in her final communion. Simultaneously, an athletic executioner reaches around to direct a slim dagger right into her chest, the very definition of a surgical strike. Drops of blood spring forth, but Lucy does not flinch. There is an emphatic left-to-right motion from Lucy's mother entering at the far left, to Lucy in the embrace of her executioner, to the priest holding the host. At the lower right, a page holds a giant candle, unnecessary in daylight, but important in sanctifying the space around Lucy as a sort of altar. The flame, of course, also refers to light, lux, the source of Lucy's name, and a crucial theme in the Bible and Christian theology. Lucy's remarkable beauty in the face of torture and death thus confers a theological point, underscoring her devotion to the communion wafer and indeed defining her saintliness. Similarly, the background is infused with meaning, recounting episodes before the murder, where various tortures, including an attempt to use teams of oxen to haul Lucy to a brothel, are rendered ineffective by her pious resolve. The mingling of apparent opposites, astonishing beauty and sadness, the painting's, quote, pictorial dissonance, in Murillo's phrase, is crucial to its power. As pointed out by Virginia, this combination of several episodes in one painting recalls the continuous narrative employed by medieval artists. But at the same time, it's completely up to date, combining distinct stages of the failed tortures, the slaying, and the Last Communion to tell Lucy's story thoroughly. Moreover, the emphasis on the host at the end as the end, the goal of this narrative, must reflect Counter-Reformation devotion to the sacrament. The combination of Lucy's martyrdom and Last Communion, so emotionally compelling, turns out to be very rare in Italian paintings. Veronese's Venetian predecessors and his successors tended to split up these episodes. Here we have Lorenzo Lotto's St. Lucy altarpiece, completed in 1532 for a church in Jesi. The customary Sacra Conversazione, which would be the typical main field, has been replaced by a gripping narrative moment. Lucy is confronting the Roman consul, who, enraged by her piety and insistence on virginity, condemns her to a brothel. The scene is repeated in the middle predella panel, that is the section of images at the base of the altarpiece, and whose right-hand section shows the teams of oxen that are unable to drag her to the brothel. Lucy's virtue is evidently so great that 2 panels worth of oxen cannot dislodge her. Compared to Lotto's multi-compartment altarpiece, where Lucy, the single figure, appears in fact 7 times, Veronese's canvas possesses a marvelous unity, demonstrating a fine pictorial mind. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo was the 18th century Venetian artist who most closely modeled himself on Veronese, and did so particularly in the 1740s. In Tiepolo's Last Communion of St. Lucy, the physical types of Lucy, the priests, the page with a candle, the background architecture are all clearly indebted to Veronese. Yet the ingenious conflation of martyrdom and Last Communion has been abandoned. The stabbing here has already taken place. Blood is visible on Lucy's neck, and the dagger lies in the right foreground, more attribute than weapon. Although Tiepolo's decision to focus solely on the Last Communion may have been iconographically motivated, right at this time the Church of Santi Apostoli received a new ceiling fresco depicting the Communion of the Apostles as its subject, this version lacks some of the power of the painting by a supposedly shallow Renaissance artist. I was part of the curatorial team for the Prado's Jacopo Tintoretto exhibition in 2007. We decided we needed to revise Tintoretto's reputation as a profound but uneven and occasionally inept painter. Reviewing the Tintoretto oeuvre, it became clear that many of the disparaged paintings were actually executed by workshop assistants or weak followers and had nothing to do with the master himself. Thus, in the Prado exhibition, we made an emphasis on quality of individual pictures, both in terms of autograph examples, that is, as close to 100% Jacopo Tintoretto as possible, as well as canvases displaying a particular finesse. And this was the overreaching goal of the show. We wanted to emphasize Tintoretto the painter, knowing that the artist's depth of feeling, particularly in religious subjects, was already secure. Back in 2009, when I began to help Virginia Brilliant with her Veronese exhibition, we realized we faced the opposite challenge. Everyone acknowledged that Veronese was remarkably talented, but there's always been the suspicion, perhaps, that he was a facile artist, dazzling but no depth. Thus, the goal had to be to emphasize his profundity and seriousness. With this in mind, Virginia decided to organize the catalog and the exhibition installation so that both concluded with 3 thematic groupings, with paintings and drawings of similar subjects. These were weighty Christian topics that would make clear how the artist carefully and thoughtfully reworked certain subjects across his career and how seriously he took the task of religious narrative paintings. The first group, centered around the Ringling Museum's magnificent altarpiece of the Rest on the Flight into Egypt, shows the Holy Family at a tranquil moment in an unusually lush setting, but one replete with foreshadowing of the Passion, from the cross formed by the 2 trees to the foreground loaves of bread, all referring to his future death. The second thematic grouping of baptisms presents variations of John the Baptist and Christ in a landscape that is at the moment of the start of Jesus' public ministry, demonstrating how attentive Veronese could be to even simple compositional challenges. The third group, showing the death of Christ, indicates an insufficiently appreciated side of the painter's personality, namely how Veronese could be stark, sober, and profound. Images like the dead Christ with an angel and friar from the end of the painter's career do not show the more common narrative episodes of the deposition or entombment, but instead show the wounded body of Christ after the crucifixion being propped up or even presented to the viewer by angels. These paintings have much in common with the Man of Sorrows tradition, so popular in Venetian art of the 15th and 16th centuries. In such pictures, Veronese, better than any of his contemporaries, successfully unites the narrative and the icon, the telling of the story and the timeless. Certainly religious themes, which focus the Ringling exhibition, stand in striking contrast to Veronese's most famous paintings. Secular topics, like the celebrated family of Darius before Alexander, we've seen several times today, or his crowded biblical feasts, which often appear irreligious in character. In his now classic study of theatricality in Veronese, David Rozan discusses how the narrative of Darius unfolds across the surface, quote, in a great wave sweeping down from the left frame. He notes that such paintings, with their left-to-right movement across a shallow stage and disjunction from the background architecture, belong to the venerable tradition of the tableau composition. These are the canvas murals that decorated scuole, that is, lay brotherhoods in Venice in the late 15th and early 16th century, exemplified by the horizontal narratives of Carpaccio. Both Carpaccio and Veronese structure their composition similarly, with a common emphasis on the painting surface, left-to-right direction, rhythmically placed groups of onlookers, and a general sense of chromatic richness and indeed splendor. Although David Rozan is correct that by the second half of the 16th century, that Veronese is, quote, the only major master committed to the tableau as a still vital theme for pictorial development, most of Veronese's contemporaries having adopted plunging perspective as an alternative, there is a fascinating example right here in Sarasota, which shows a minor painter continuing the Carpaccio tradition even more faithfully. Consider this 1574 work by Antonio Palma. He's the nephew of Palma Vecchio and a student of Bonifacio de Pitati. This Esther before Assuerus in the Ringling Museum possesses fundamentally the same composition and employs the same pictorial strategies, emphasizing the surface as both the Veronese and Carpaccio examples. They're essentially the same painting. On the other hand, the style, physical types, palette, particularly brushwork, is almost remarkably outmoded for the 1570s, as if Veronese and Tintoretto had never happened. One of Rozan's key comparisons is that between Veronese's family of Darius, with its insistence on frontality, and Tintoretto's contemporary painting of the removal of the body of St. Mark. Tintoretto abandons the Venetian tableau tradition in order to challenge the integrity of the picture plane, establishing a primary narrative axis perpendicular to that picture plane. The viewing point is higher, and more of the pavement is thus visible. The action takes place within the setting rather than at the front of the stage. Tintoretto has emphasized an atmospheric tonal unity rather than the gleaming local colors of Veronese. One could add that while Veronese's painting is full of onlookers, exemplary spectators who reveal their emotions like actors through elegant gestures and facial expressions, typically most of the figures in a Tintoretto picture seem involved with the action itself. They take part rather than watch. A reasonable surrogate in the exhibition is the Darius is the Christ and the Centurion from Kansas City. This work replicates much of the London painting's composition, palette, and indeed poses. The story of Christ and the Centurion is rare in Italian art, but was a specialty of Veronese and his workshop. Here, the faith and deference shown by the Roman military officer, who's kneeling there, prompts Christ to heal the soldier servant who is bedridden. Even if substantial portions of this painting were completed by assistants, and there are many subsidiary figures are kind of bland, and there are other areas with almost too much detail, the range of splendid costumes and textures, from armor to rich velvet, not to mention rhetorical gestures, again, the Veronese hand, is fully in keeping with Paolo's practice. At the same time, this painting falls into a larger category of Veronese's Christian subjects that appear secular. Simply swapping out the figure of Christ on the left for a second soldier would eliminate any Christian feeling and suggest a topic from Roman history. In the Kansas City picture, however, there may be a connection or concession to Tintoretto and the post-Carpaccio interest in perspectival settings, because although the main figure groups continue to dominate the shallow foreground, Veronese plays a deft trick and introduces a deep procession all the way to the background architecture. our eyes are drawn to the distant detail of archway and the dog by the right hand of the centurion. And Veronese has achieved this plunging effect with only a few inches of picture surface. This view to great depth emphasizes, therefore, the immediacy of the protagonists just beyond our space and pulls us, the viewer, into the world. Perhaps a fairer comparison between Tintoretto and Veronese would be two pictures depicting similar religious narratives, attempted tortures or martyrdoms. Tintoretto's breakthrough painting, The Miracle of the Slave of 1548, makes clear from the variety of vigorous poses how St. Mark, who's swooping in from above, was able to foil the tortures of his devoted servant lying on the pavement. The typical Venetian left-to-right progression here has been turbocharged. One of Tintoretto's tactics is to isolate or silhouette key gestures, such as the pieces of the shattered mallet held aloft by the turbaned man. Tintoretto also employs greater chiaroscuro to emphasize certain figures, and indeed reduce the prominence of others. And he tends to minimize attention on facial expression in favor of energized poses. Very few figures in this painting stand upright or stand at rest. By contrast, Veronese's Martyrdom of St. Sebastian, this is essentially an echo of Tintoretto's composition, with torturers and onlookers crowding around a prostrate victim. Somewhat less successfully, however, Veronese largely overlaps his figures and does not isolate gestures against the sky, relying instead on local color to keep the individuals distinct. The result is a story that is much harder to read. To his credit, however, the angle of Veronese's St. Sebastian being tied down before his final beating offers a knowing allusion to his counterpart in Titian's great martyrdom of St. Lawrence. Moving from surface of canvas to the space of the viewer, Veronese's paintings for the Nave of San Sebastiano display an awareness of the actual space of the building. Here the painter utilized the space of the nave to depict the failed martyrdom of St. Sebastian, where the arrows that riddled his body did not kill him. Here we're looking towards the church's main entrance from the altar end, and we're considering the frescoes in the upper left at the extreme, considering there and there. You can see the extreme left and right of the slide. Veronese's conceit is that the archers are aiming at Sebastian on the opposite wall, across the real space of the nave, and their arrows cross that space to pierce him. Any observer up in the balcony, that is the monks, the patrons of these frescoes, would gaze at these frescoes and be swept up in the narrative. Veronese completed the 3 ceiling canvases along the central spine of the ceiling in 1556. These pictures constitute his artistic breakthrough and make clear he had surmounted the compositional challenge of ceiling paintings and simultaneously introduced a new sumptuousness of brushwork. These paintings bring us back to the surface. The Triumph of Mordecai is the kind of ceiling painting that Veronese favored, as if we're looking up a steep flight of steps. Veronese maintains the overlapping figures that seem to press up against the picture plane, even if by logic, these warriors and horses should be perpendicular to the surface of the painting. Similarly, the strong vertical of the composition, underscored by the heavy cornice of the building, should be far away, and this appears to press down, in contrast, on the canvas surface. These are pictorial paradoxes and energize the painting. This emphasis on the surface is most apparent, however, in the manipulation of paint, where Veronese's feathery touch includes impastos like icing on a cake. Dry brushes dragged across the canvas convey texture, across the canvas texture can convey broken lines, and these broken lines convey beautifully, in turn, the gleam of metal or highlights on thick velvet. Each brushstroke thus both describes form and can be appreciated on the canvas surface for its own beauty. This is the beauty of paint. The skills that Veronese refined in San Sebastiano prepared him for working quickly on an even larger scale. His enormous and overpopulated banquet scenes. The Feast in the House of Levi is the kind of painting that prompted the criticism by Sir Joshua Reynolds mentioned earlier. Reynolds sarcastically declared that Veronese could only undertake teeming canvases. Quote, "I can easily conceive that Paul Veronese, if he were asked, would say that no subject was proper for an historical picture, but such as admitted at least 40 figures. For in less a number, he would assert, there could be no opportunity of a painter showing his art in composition." In Reynolds' view, Veronese adopted an undeniable busyness in his paintings so he could flaunt his skills. Veronese had in fact responded to similar but more serious charges when he was called before the Inquisition in the summer of 1573 to justify the presence of extraneous figures in his Last Supper, characters not befitting the sacred subject. Before the Inquisition, the painter defended himself by asserting that, quote, "We painters assume the same license as do poets and jesters," and that, quote, "If in a picture there is extra space, I enrich it with figures according to the subject." Veronese insisted that he had carefully considered these additions. The features that the Inquisitor found scurrilous, the buffoons, drunkards, dwarves, and Germans meaning Protestants, were actually outside the space of Christ and his apostles, thus obeying religious decorum. This central section of the much larger picture, in fact, offers a much more conventional Last Supper. To be fair to Veronese, his feast pictures were destined for huge spaces, and this is made clear within the exhibition by the 1992 photograph by Thomas Struth. Veronese's religious banquets were intended for the end walls of refectories, that is, the dining halls of monasteries. By contrast, Tintoretto's Last Suppers were for parish churches, the side walls of chapels, sometimes on the wall of the nave, and therefore considerably smaller in intended scope. So given the huge size of these refectories, Veronese either would have had to enlarge the scale of the individual figures dramatically, or produce largely empty physical settings in his paintings. True to his word, Veronese preferred to fill up the canvas with figures. A decade earlier, Veronese created the Wedding Feast at Cana, his tallest and most teeming feast picture. Here, Christ's first public miracle, the conversion of water into wine, is joined by about 130 figures and set amid triumphant Palladian architecture. The Christian story isn't immediately identifiable, though as described in last night's lecture, there is plenty of theological discussion if one pays attention to the central axis. Could there be a deeper meaning to this splendor itself? Might Veronese's giant feast canvases celebrate the magnificence and stability of the Venetian state? Venice was the most serene republic, after all, and such paintings show Christianity in a Venetian guise, a Venetian language. Veronese may be offering in his feast pictures an ideal vision, a perfect city where everyone is elegant and eloquent. We might push this a little farther and speculate that paradoxically, these secular and worldly feast pictures might be considered an alternate heaven, where the souls and the angels wear costumes of the finest silks and occupy resplendent, up-to-date architecture. Of course, drawings in the exhibition for the commission of the Paradiso mural offer one version of how Veronese viewed heaven, orderly groups seated on cloud banks, but it is tempting to see his banquet pictures as equivalents of paradise. I'd like to conclude by considering a final example of Veronese's religious paintings, and this is his skill at merging the narrative, the telling of a story, with the iconic, meaning the presentation of Christ or Christian ideals outside of time. Veronese accomplishes this synthesis better than any of his contemporaries. A striking example can in fact be seen in the Wedding Feast at Cana, where amidst the dozens of figures taking part in the festivities, Christ stares straight ahead, motionless and timeless. Within the crowded narrative, he can be isolated like an icon. In particular, Veronese's treatment of passion imagery demonstrates his confident conflation of narrative and icon. Here, Christ, just moments before his betrayal, is held up by an angel for the viewer's benefit. We see Christ at his most human and vulnerable as he faints. But also his sacrifice is right there in front of us, again as on a shallow stage, and simultaneously an icon, thus, of suffering, an object for prayer. By contrast, Titian places Christ deep in his composition of the same subject, focusing on Christ's plight, but distancing him from the viewer. This Dead Christ is another great late religious painting by Veronese, but once again, the moment is more complicated than a simple pietà, the pietà being the timeless sorrow of the Virgin Mary for her dead son. Here she props him up and presents him frontally, not just so that we can see him in worship, but also so she can help him stand. In one of Veronese's most moving gestures, the angel's fingers of his right hand are intertwined with those of Christ's left, and the dead Christ is in fact beseeched to come back to life. This is the very moment of the resurrection. Veronese's synthesis of icon and narrative makes sense when one considers the painting's original placement, on an altar dedicated to the Pietà. There, the prominence of Christ's body underscored, of course, a Eucharistic function. Agostino Carracci's great engraving allowed Veronese's profound invention in that painting to reach a large audience and indeed be included in the Ringling exhibition. The exhibition concludes poignantly with the lunette of the Dead Christ with Angels, the upper fragment of the once enormous Petrobelli altarpiece. Ostensibly, the moment is timeless, Christ presented to the viewer for our grieving. The poses of the three angels draw attention to Christ's wounds. Yet by taking his arms in theirs, the angels seem to urge him to stand. Christ appears to be poised on the edge of his rebirth. And I believe Veronese may deserve credit for introducing this concept to Venetian painting. At the same time, Veronese, with his deft and ostentatious highlights on satin and cloud, reminds us of the surface of the painting and the beauty of his brushwork. Veronese's religious narrative paintings show him to be far more than a decorative painter. Indeed, he is a painter of paradoxes. He conflated episodes in synthesized stories. He had a rare ability to combine opposites, the beautiful and the horrific, as we saw at the beginning with St. Lucy. He could merge, better than any of his rivals, narrative moments and iconic timelessness. In paintings like this Dead Christ with Angel, Veronese proclaimed that Christ's passion was not a dead end, but rather a new beginning, and that a picture offering such beauty on the surface could also be quite deep. Thank you. Oh, really?
Is this even? No, yes, this is on. Good. Thank you, Frederick. Moving right along, next we'll be hearing from Stephen Campbell. Stephen is the Henry and Elizabeth Wiesenfeld Professor and Chair for Art for the History of Art at Johns Hopkins University. A specialist in Italian art of the 15th and 16th centuries, his work is particularly focused on the artistic culture of North Italian court centers. Did I just get rid of your slide?
I don't think it ever came up.
Oh, good. Sorry, I hit something and I didn't know if something bad had happened. Sorry. Stephen has published several books, including The Cabinet of Eros, Renaissance Mythological Painting in the Studiolo of Isabella d'Este, Cosmetura Ferrara, Style, Politics in the Renaissance City, 1450 to 95, and Art in Italy, 1400 to 1600, co-authored with Michael Cole, published by Thames and Hudson in 2011. Stephen was educated at Trinity College Dublin and the University of North Carolina and Johns Hopkins University, and before joining the faculty at Hopkins in 2002, he taught at Case Western Reserve University, the University of Michigan, and the University of Pennsylvania. He's published more articles and given more lectures than I could ever possibly list now, and has held fellowships at the Met, ITATI, CASVA, and on and on and on. Today he will be speaking to us about Veronese and the painting of history. Stephen.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Virginia, and Frederick for making this wonderful show, which has resulted in this present event. I'm learning so much about Veronese and very much enjoying today's event. As you can see, I've replaced my really boring title on the program with a really mystifying one. And I'm sorry about that. I had to, kicking and screaming, I gave up the PowerPoint on Tuesday, and I haven't been able to make changes since. So it's the chain of lowering relation, conjunctive poetics, and the art of Paolo Veronese. It does in some ways concern narrative, but it also concerns how Veronese takes a conventional type, like a portrait or an event from the New Testament, and really make it into subject matter, make it style it in his own way, creating what a 16th century writer in art would call invention, a poetic invention. So my topic is really Veronese and invention. Veronese, we are often told, enjoyed the special favor of the great Titian, the senior artist of Venice and the most famous living artist in Europe by the 1560s, almost to the point of being a designated successor. But what did it mean to be a Titian follower in northern Italy at mid-century? Primarily, it meant contesting a notoriously partisan history and geography of art, powerfully formulated in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists in 1550 and second edition 1568, and promoted in new state institutions like the Florentine Accademia di Disegno. an ideology of the center which asserted the priority of Florence and Rome, of Raphael, of Michelangelo, and Roman antiquity. Opposition to Vasari in northern Italy organized itself around the name Titian, supposedly the flag bearer of an alternative and independent pictorial tradition, which Vasari had pronounced to be deficient and inferior. In his 1557 dialogue on painting, the writer Lodovico Dolce declared that Titian had invented a new manner in Venice, one he described as the essence of perfect painting, invented from nature without any experience of or dependency on the antiquities of Rome. Completely autonomous, in other words, from what had been the only possible origin of good painting, and surpassing the labored and monotonous character of Michelangelo's art. Titian's manner had the truth of nature and the grace of lyric poetry. The problem for young Venetian painters, like Jacopo Tintoretto, and artists of the terra firma, like Paolo Cagliari or Veronese, was what coming after Titian, what being in the tradition of Titian, actually amounted to. The view of Titian as a kind of anti-Michelangelo, whose pursuit of sensual grace and truth to nature made him something akin to a new Raphael, this is what Dolce says, offered very few practical pointers. Titian's later work, in particular, could not be made to yield up formulas or principles subject to academic codification. In particular, the more Titian's contemporaries invested in his work as a kind of painterly production of Venice, the more Titian seems to have retreated into a kind of self-reflexive, even solipsistic placelessness. Especially in the case of the late paintings for locations in Italy, that's less the case for his Habsburg commissions for other parts of Europe, Titian's works preempt their own history of non-reception, of incomprehension, or even outright rejection. There was a second version of this enunciation was made for San Domenico in Naples, and that proved to be very, very controversial, and an entire treatise had to be written in its defense. Very disturbing, strange picture in which the world seems to be bursting into flames at the moment of the incarnation. The vase of flowers has caught fire as this massive, hulking football player of an angel has come into startled the Virgin in her bedchamber. Such an estranging character is the result of Titian's uneasy relation to the role he was increasingly called upon to perform, to be not just the chief painter of Venice, but, as it were, to be Venetian painting, as this is increasingly characterized in a rising critical literature of art from the 1540s onwards. The artistic reception of one of Titian's major altarpieces for a prominent location outside Venice, the Crowning with Thorns for Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, reveals that when Venetian and Lombard artists responded to the painting, they generally found that something needed to be fixed. The emotional register of the image, even the legibility of its narrative, is curiously indeterminate. For example, I have a pointer here, the two men in the foreground, it's by no means clear what these men are actually doing in the composition. One seems to have his arm around the other. They seem to be looking in the face of Christ, handling the wand there. Is he restraining him? Are they like trying to disassociate themselves from this violent, blasphemous event? Or what? When artists responded, they had to decide. They had to interpret what was going on here. We could say there's a problem of relationality among these figures. And I'll be talking a lot about relationality, picking up on themes raised by Frederick and by David Rozand yesterday about the tableau, and especially in Veronese's case. Andrea Schiavoni's woodcut version, an important document of the work's reception by one of Titian's own artistic colleagues in Venice, shows a clear attempt to rationalize the composition and to make sense of the odd behavior of the soldiers in the foreground, who become now much more obviously commentator figures. The entire composition has been rotated to the side, and there's been an imposition of a volume of space between the two men, now cast as observers, and the group of Christ and his tormentors. So this is what Titian's followers, especially in, here again, in the interest of time, I'm going to pass over that. Setting yourself up as a follower of Titian, what are you supposed to look like? And here's Simone Peterzano, better known as the teacher of Caravaggio. He signs this painting in 1573, Simone Peterzano's Titianae alumnus, Simone Peterzano, the pupil of Titian, and gives us a painting which looks nothing like Titian. What it actually is like what it's most like in Venice is Veronese. And here's the Hermitage painting. It's from 1581, from a few years later. Veronese is also an artist of northern Italy who's drawing very much on a North Italian heritage of artists of the terra firma, like Moretto of Brescia, as you can see here in juxtaposing these two paintings. So I'm just setting this up as a kind of an analogy between Peterzano and Veronese, and to do with the problem of coming after Titian. What I want to examine today is the ways in which Veronese became the sort of artist that his contemporaries, especially the literate and artistically literate, wanted Titian to be. Far more than Titian, Veronese corresponded with a set of theoretical and aesthetic norms for Venetian painting laid out in Dolce's 1557 dialogue I mentioned earlier. Dolce had not yet registered the existence of Veronese, working in Venice since 1553, but it is Veronese, more than Titian, who proved to be the most aptly characterized by the critical desiderata of Dolce's dialogue. It's not just that Veronese is an artist of lyric grace, who invested ideal beauty with sensuous appeal, nor is it that he produced a monumental art capable of appealing to aristocratic patrons who had previously looked to Vasari, Salviati, and the Roman High Renaissance. The family of Darius before Alexander is exactly the kind of subject matter extolled in Dolce's dialogue, where the name of Alexander recurs in passages to do with the narrative skills of Raphael, the nobility of painting, appreciated by the stories of Alexander and Apelles and Alexander and Campaspe, and philosophically enlightened patronage. In the same pages, Dolce evokes Aristotle's Poetics, the importance of which in the case of Veronese's painting has been frequently recognized, but I think cannot be emphasized enough. One of the best ways of understanding what Veronese was doing in this painting is to see it as a demonstration of some of the key critical principles of the Poetics. It fulfills the criteria for what Aristotle called a recognition scene. In Poetics, Aristotle had defined anagnorisis as a change from ignorance to knowledge, producing love or hate between the persons destined by the poet for good or bad fortune. Do you know the story here where Alexander has defeated Darius, Darius has gone on the run, the family of Darius appear before Alexander, and the mother of Darius throws herself on her knees before the warrior she thinks is Alexander, but in fact it's Hephaestion. And she's, of course, mortified when a slave tells her that that's not really Alexander. And Alexander says, mother, it's okay. He doesn't say that, but he addresses her as mother, and this also is Alexander, right? And there's no doubt that this is supposed to be Alexander who's speaking and pointing to Hephaestion here in the painting. So this is a recognition scene. So it's very specific. We're in a climate of intense reading and translation and commenting on Aristotle's Poetics in the late 16th century. A good deal of what makes the family of Darius so distinctive, the choice of subject and the moment in the story. We should also remember that Alexander was the pupil of Aristotle, and as well as the dramatic mise en scène, can be explained once its appeal to readers of the Poetics is understood. And the Pisani family, for whose palace at Montagnana this painting was produced, have recently been shown by Claudia Terribile to be active sponsors of neoclassical drama on Aristotelian principles. Now, in case I seem to be here presenting Veronese as a kind of middlebrow artist of the mainstream, or merely as an illustration of Dolce's Aristotelian and Petrarchan critical principles, let me just say at once, and then go on to show that nothing could be further from the case, that there's much more to Veronese than this. To be sure, Veronese's standing as a painter of Petrarchan poetic values, grazia, piacevolezza, venusta, has long been recognized, but not always to the artist's advantage. I'm sorry, I seem to be losing my voice. Veronese's urbanity and wit, his sumptuously attired figures, and magnificent theatrical settings, not to mention his famous appearance before the Inquisition for including trivial and curious elements in his San Giorgio Maggiore Last Supper, has made him into the poster child for the early modern tourist Venice, of carnivals and lavish entertainments, of courtesans and libertines with their parrots, dogs, and pages. and dwarfs. A hedonist impresario who held up a mirror to his audience. We're not supposed to see Veronese as being that profound, and Frederick has leaned on this, and so has David, as taking his religious subject matter as other than a vehicle for virtuosic set pieces, abounding in portraits, adorable children, and their dogs. Yet there have been a few who would not leave things this way. And we've heard already the name Gian Domenico Tiepolo, who we're going to hear more about later. When Michael Baxendale and Svetlana Alpers write of Tiepolo's pictorial intelligence, much of what they are writing about is Tiepolo looking back at Veronese, getting to grips with his extraordinary compositional procedures, or more precisely, the way he manages broad horizontal formats, laterali and portico paintings, not just through the formal plastic organization of color and form, but through the subtle yet radical ways he creates relations among human figures and between bodies and space. I'm going to use the term here, relationality, which is probably still more common in film criticism than it is in art history. It just means a state of how relations are created. It's also a term in grammar. Pictorial structure is generated in Veronese, and then in Tiepolo, by what can be called embodied intersubjectivity, the studied effects of bodies in shared space, gazes locked or averted, proximities creating casual intimacy or constrained withdrawal, intervals charged by ceremonial deference or longing, gestures of inclusion or self-protection, of command or interpolation. Long before Baxendale and Alpers, none other than the great Victorian critic John Ruskin seems to have understood this. For Ruskin, Veronese was a painter who chooses to represent the great relations of visible things to each other. I'm sorry if this is hard on the eyes. It looked really different on my computer at home. I hope you can read that. To the heaven above and to the earth beneath them. The Victorian critic's account of the Virgin and Child with saints and the Cucina family has seldom been surpassed. Ruskin admired the concreteness with which Veronese staged the relationships between the divine sphere and that of the everyday domestic world. In such paintings, writes Ruskin, the Madonnas are no more seated apart on their thrones, the saints no more breathe celestial air. They are on our own playing ground, nay, here in our houses with us, all kind of worldly business going on in their presence, fearlessly, our own friends and respected acquaintances with all their mortal faults, and in their mortal flesh, looking at them face to face, unalarmed, nay, our dearest children, playing with their pet dogs at Christ's very feet. His account of the Cucina painting, which Ruskin believed to represent Veronese's own family, concludes with observations on the behavior of dogs and children, who break the chain of devotional continuum linking the Virgin through the allegories of faith, hope, and charity to the adult family members. That is the figure of faith, there's hope, and there's charity. So we have portraits here of the Cucina family, extended clan, and the three allegories here, and then the saints. And Blake de Maria has written wonderfully and usefully about this in her recent book. The youngest child, this is Ruskin again, perhaps about 3 years old, is neither frightened nor interested, but finds the ceremony tedious and is trying to coax the dog to play with him. But the dog, which is one of the little curly, short-nosed, fringy-pawed things which all Venetian ladies petted, will not now be coaxed, for the dog is the last link in the chain of lowering feeling and takes his doggish views of the matter. You can't write about painting this way anymore. More's the pity. Maybe you think it's a relief that they can't. Ruskin recognized that Veronese's paintings explores what we call the transpersonal dimensions of individual identity, the ways this chain of relations is expressed both through ritual formation as well as through more spontaneous and intimate physical contact and gesture, even through the state of childish distraction, which extends the chain or continuum, even if it might seem to be loosening it. Now, however, because Ruskin wanted to idealize the portrait group as a paradigm of the Christian nuclear family, he missed the degree to which Veronese was actually creating a dramatic subject here, a drama of relationality. That for all its apparent immediacy, something altogether more suspenseful and potentially fraught is being transacted among these figures. There's a structure of mediation that is scriptural, that is to say, textual in origin. It is frequently stated, sorry, I'll just go back here, that's a bit premature. It's frequently stated from Ruskin onwards that the Cucina family are depicted looking at the Virgin and saints, following the formula of older family votive pictures that Veronese would have known from his native sorry, excuse me, going the wrong direction. Yeah. Like Altichiero's late Trecento Cavalli family, a votive painting which shows male members of a family lined up between the enthroned Virgin, as you can see. In fact, in Veronese's painting, none of the men, women, or children here actually see the Virgin. Their gazes are decidedly focused elsewhere. The one possible exception is the figure identified by Blake as Antonio Cucina, who is also quite far away. And while he looks most intently in her general direction, it's still not fully apparent that he sees the heavenly assembly beyond the columns. Recently, again, de Maria suggested that the painting may have been completed following the death of Antonio Cucina, along with his nearby nephew Andrea, who's this boy here, I think, in late 1573. I'd like to hear other people's views on that it's actually later than 1573. This could very well explain the way Antonio is singled out by the fervor of his demeanor and his orientation towards the heavenly group. He is also distinguished by the fact that he makes physical contact with two of the cardinal virtues. Charity clasps his forearms, while faith takes his right hand. Hope, strikingly attired in a black veil of mourning, looks protectively over Andrea. Faith, in fact, is the pivotal generating figure of the entire invention. We've moved from votive portrait to invention. The family's devout attention to a divine assembly they cannot see, under the guidance of the white road personification, is Veronese's pictorial visualization of a series of biblical verses. John 20:29. Blessed are those who have not yet seen, who have not seen and yet have believed. Hebrews 2:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. 2 Corinthians 6:7. We walk by faith, not by sight. There's something distinctly evangelical about the theological argument of the Cucina painting, which might lead to some interesting inquiry about the religious orientation of the patrons. And this bears emphasizing because of the constant stereotypical view of Veronese as uncomplicated by literary or textual contaminations or even serious theological interests. And this has been knocked on the head already in the previous presentation. That he was a painter's painter who confronted pure existence in itself. The view of Veronese as a mere decorator goes back to Burckhardt, and it's quite a powerful passage in Burckhardt. This is a famous guidebook written in the 1870s called the Cicerone, and nobody went to Italy without the Cicerone. It's translated into English very early, and here's the English translation. It's quite striking. Paolo, says Burckhardt, always brings the event as much as possible to an existence picture, Existenzbild, moderates his pathos most carefully, avoids the excesses of naturalism, and keeps in this way the necessary composure to display his coloring in triumphant splendor. The paintings come out as a necessary and highest product of the painting of life, which here shakes off the last fetters of the historical picture. That's crucial. We're getting, it's a departure from history painting into something more modern. Realism, and only requires the remains of a pretext to celebrate all the splendor and glory of the earth in unrestrained rejoicing. Above all, a beautiful and free human race in full enjoyment of their existence. If we want Veronese as a decorator, we want to have a decorator in this way, in other words. But it's wrong, obviously. We no longer have to follow 19th and 20th century criticism in Veronese in accepting a kind of essential dichotomy between history paintings based on texts and the representation of existence. Veronese was an artist whose appeal was to an audience of readers, even to an audience who read text repeatedly and committed them to memory. That makes it hard, really, to see paintings with historical eyes, with the period eye, as it were. This audience is hardwired to understand certain pictorial relationalities in terms of their own personal literary formation. The dichotomy between representing the world and representing the world as already fictively constructed by literary texts would have been meaningless to Veronese or his audience. Paintings were to be read as well as to be perceived with the senses. Thus, in the family of Darius before Alexander, Veronese's preoccupation with disclosing connections and attachments between figures is congruent with and intensified by the very words spoken by Alexander to the mother of Darius at this point of the summer, at this point in the story. "You are not mistaken, mother. This man too is Alexander." Alexander's words acquire a performative force in the painting that they do not necessarily possess in the historical account. With his words and gestures, the exemplary hero figure creates doubles of himself, extends his own being onto and through the bodies of others. Individual identity is produced through assemblage, and as the attachment is pronounced and performed, it is given a counterpoint in the triangulated gazes of three boys. Who constitute the outer limits of what we can call the Alexander-Hephaestion assemblage. There's this group here, and which mark it as an assemblage of armed bodies, dogs, and horses. Masculine, very man's world here. The small boys can also be seen as dispersals of Alexander beyond his singular embodiment in one place. Alexander produces not just a double in the person of Hephaestion, as an ideal of princely behavior, a schoolroom exemplar held up for the mimetic formation of the young, he produces minor, little versions of himself. Alexander's right hand extends across the edge of a hiatus between the two principal groups. It is motioning towards the daughter of Darius, Statira, who we might finally notice is being pointed at forcefully or being indicated by her mother, by the grandmother. We know that subsequent to this episode, she will be joined in marriage with Alexander. The prince's right hand thus initiates the dextrarum junctio, the performative gestural expression of the conjugal bond. When a couple joins their right hands and say, I marry you, that's the performative use of language. It's actually language that does something. This is Alexander is another performative use of language in the same way. Yeah, cool. Veronese was, as you will see, deeply preoccupied with the conjugal as both an iconographic as well as a compositional principle. His investment in it goes well beyond an orientation towards themes connected with marriage and the family, which is where most art historical analyses have tended to linger. But before leaving the great canvas for the Pisani, I want to point to the relevance of Ruskin's comments for the family of Darius. At work in this composition, too, is a chain of lowering feeling. The exact center of the composition is dominated by a pyramidal group, the family of Darius, who, as we saw, which seems to be pulled to the right towards the anchoring figure of Alexander, who, as we saw, creates a chain of relations to Hephaestion and to the daughter of Darius, and to other bodies compositionally linked to his. Yet at the outer limits of this assemblage, moving to the left, the chain seems to loosen. The relationality is more dispersed across a spatial hiatus, and the relationship to Alexander becomes one of more of oppositionality or inversion in terms of species and gender. As in the Cucina family, the invisible chain that bonds the figures loosens where a child is distracted by a creature. You can see the little girl at the end there, even more fully disengaged from the principal action or orientation of the group. Thus, the dissolution of the Alexander assemblage is a spatial void to the left, precisely where a monkey holds a slackening chain. On one side, a small girl reaches in the direction of a couple of puppies, withheld from her by a dwarf, who is fully pulled away from the main cluster of figures, and by a female attendant in orientalizing costume, paired with an almost identical companion, also in strict profile. The doubling of the female in profile here is actually part of a systematic multiplication of similar forms across the canvas. It is picked up by the paired sphinx-like figures on the fountain. Just compare those profiles. Again, these sort of exoticizing profiles. And then culminates in this on the shield, the bronze siren held by the page in the right foreground. However clear the formal correspondence, the continuum is loosened by physical distance, a looseness manifest through alterity and radical instability in a series of shifts from human to artificial, from exotic to monstrous. Other surprising correspondences occur in this hiatus zone of loosened connections, like the curve of the pike with the foreleg of the horse in the foreground. And we see this kind of dispersal, formal dispersal, at distant points of a composition, also in the Cucina family, where the Virgin is confronted at the other end of the painting by a figure of a nurse with a child, at the edge of a hiatus, who's like kind of a double, but like hierarchically absolutely the inverse of the Virgin and Child. The further away, the more inverse the relation gets, even as there is a formal resemblance. I suggested a moment ago that art historians tend to be rather fixed on marriage and the family as an explanatory principle for a good deal of everything, a good deal of Renaissance secular art. This is not to say that some of Veronese's paintings aren't, at many levels, about marriage and the family, but that kinship relations are just one kind among many that he stages and explores in his work, or are secondary to an interest in the principle of relation itself, frequently pursued to the same formal and iconographic vocabulary. As if foregrounding conjoined bodies as his art's central preoccupation, the figure of the chain, the yoke, the bridle, and the restraint occurs throughout his paintings. It appears first in the great fresco cycle for the Villa Barbaro at Nasr, where Veronese probably worked from a program devised by the co-owner Daniele Barbaro, the learned commentator in Vitruvius and many other things. Inge Reist has shown that the generating principle of the elaborate iconography is a fragment of Empedocles, preserved in citations by Aristotle, on the power of Eros to yoke all things together. And she cites this marvelous text, we'll be back to that in a minute, by Benedetto Varchi, a member of Daniele Barbaro's academic circle, elaborating on this principle of the conjoining power of Eros. Only love binds and holds united heaven and earth, so that, if but for a second he loosens one rein, where now there is love and peace, there would be war, and the loss of that faith, which now the heavens and the elements direct onto the people, would be the cause of sudden ruin and destruction. Love still binds, conjunge, with firm friendships, the villas and cities. He applies a bridle to the marital knot, el nodo marital pon costo freno, and dictates its laws to faithful friends. Cutting a bit. Never has the theme of conjugal bonds been treated so vividly and explicitly as we see it by Veronese in these frescoes, with its imagery of binding, restraining, and even of bridling. The allegory of conjugal love, in the room of the same name, presents a kneeling bride with Juno, Hymen, and other gods of matrimony. Juno appears with a yoke, a thing you put on oxen, big wooden thing, while on the other side there's a male god with a leather strap, identified as Eugatinus, a god who presides again over the marital bond. Fortune curbs force in the so-called Room of the Dog, while the allegorical pairings of the Room of the Lantern include a disturbing adaptation of Cartari's Allegory of Nemesis, or Corrective Justice. In Cartari, the figure had been a woman bearing a tally stick and a bridle, and a similar Dürer treated her in somewhat similar way. But in Veronese, it appears as if a male figure has usurped the female's attributes and used them to subject her. She struggles to remove the bridle clenched between her teeth. The physical principle of restraint and conjoining, often underscored by the symbol of the yoke, bridle, or chain, appears in subsequent years across the entire range of Veronese's artistic production, and in most instances not in contexts related to matrimony. What this underscores, I would maintain, is a more general preoccupation in the artist's work with the forces, kinship, devotion, loyalty, love, desire, or more mysterious sympathies, that join bodies and produce transpersonal manifestations of identity. We might think, it might be Zolotti, but designed by Veronese. Freedom breaking her bonds in the Sala dell'Udienza, the Doge's Palace. The figure here of an allegory holding a large yoke. Dialectic holding this like taut web of threads over her head here, also in the Doge's Palace. Europa either being tethered onto the bull or having her dress fastened or unfastened by one of her maids in the painting for Contarini in the Doge's Palace, and of course this one, Cupid with two chained dogs. Perhaps the most remarkable and the most outrightly subversive is the Mars and Venus in New York. It's been recognized that Cupid here binds the limbs of Mars and Venus in what can probably be called a love knot. like we see here in this emblem here. However, the inference from this, that this painting is yet again another mythological allegory of marriage and fertility, seems misconceived. It is to be noted that Mars and Venus are being joined by their left leg. The significance of this can easily be grasped if you recognize the frequency of joined right hands in Veronese's work. Such a gesture, in the case of the family of Darius, or the Cucina family, designates legitimate nuptial union. It is a name and a classical pedigree, dextrarum junctio. But this is downright sinister, to play on the word sinister. The union of Mars and Venus is solemnized in what can only be called a sinistrarum junctio, a pathetic yoking of the left leg that parodies the entire idea of marriage. This is a completely adulterous relationship, despite what is always asserted. Venus is married to Vulcan. Is, after all, a triumph of carnal and adulterous love. That a light and satiric tone is intended here is signaled in the carved torso of a satyr, a characteristic Veronese triangulation of two protagonists that makes fun of both of them. Yet there's also pronounced philosophical overtones that have implications for the kind of audience we have to posit for this painting. The great materialist epic of nature, the De Rerum Natura of Lucretius, begins with a famous invocation of Alma Veneris, the goddess of desire and the reproductive impulse in living creatures, who restores peace to war-torn Italy through her domination of Mavors armipotens, Mars potent in arms, whose power and whose bellicose fury is momentarily calmed. The Lucretian subject, that's another dextrarum, that's a dextrarum junctio there. The Lucretian subject had been treated in a humorous and bawdy vein by Rosso Fiorentino half a century beforehand. In fact, the joke rests on the beholder's capacity to make the leap from Mavors armipotens to Mavors impotens. Stripped of his weapons, it's as if Mars has been deprived of his manly strength, if not his manhood, by Venus. Veronese could have known Rosso's invention from Jacopo Caraglio's engraving. Both the drawing and the engraving are mentioned in Vasari. He may even have known that Rosso's original drawing had been sent from Venice by the satirist Pietro Aretino as a somewhat belittling gift to the French king Francis I, with the result that the painter, Rosso, became an honored member of the royal household. I guess Francis could take a joke if this is the case. This may have some bearing on how we reconstruct the original destination of Veronese's picture. And I am persuaded by the hypothesis that it was made for another northern ruler, the Emperor Rudolf II. The court culture of Prague under Rudolf was a major locus of scientific thought influenced by Lucretian materialism. In addition, a prominent humanist physician attached to the imperial court, Johannes Sambucus, published a book of emblems, 1564, and many editions, including one in Italian, which provides a number of strikingly similar treatments of the theme of love, involving chains, etc. I wonder if Sambucus had anything to do with the invention of Veronese's painting. And of course, I think there's something very, the correspondence between the cupids with chains here and chains here is quite striking. I hope there's not some terrible pun going on here about amor cane jugale. Sorry about that. Mythology serves as an excursus on sexual physiology, albeit in a satiric vein. The unmanning of Mars through his union with Venus is signaled in Cupid's thwarting of the horse with the war god's sword in the background. And sexual pleasure and release is entirely the prerogative of Venus, signaled in her erect posture and her vigorous expression of milk. Lactation is more than a metaphor of venereal pleasure here. It is also connected in Galenic medicine with the belief that the womb and the breast are connected, that female sexual pleasure involved the emission of fluids, and that all bodily fluids, especially those related to the womb and the breast, are fungible. They can be transformed into each other. The expression on the face of Venus makes clear, I think, what is taking place. In the achievement of this arousal, Mars now does no more than lend a hand. And I'm going to conclude pretty rapidly, but I can't resist talking about these. The four allegories in London were probably conceived at the same time and were acquired, if not made, for Rudolf II. They offer a highly sophisticated exploration of the psychology of love and love's discontents, which more than any work by Veronese demand that we pay attention to bodily combinations, especially to the operation of right and left hands. the so-called unfaithfulness, where the woman with her left hand is slipping a letter to this guy who's looking out of the corner of his eye at this guy, the deceived lover, just plays on this right and left-handed theme. It's also just brilliant the way he uses interval and the gaze, and the half gaze and the implied gaze to help us to understand what's going on. Once we grasp the principle at work, it is apparent that the canvas frequently referred to as the allegory of conjugal love. I don't have time to talk all about the hand stuff going on here. Let's see. But this, I'll just talk about this, is anything but. While the olive branch here signals reconciliation of these two, this unhappy couple, the fact that the male and female figure grasp it with opposite hands signals that harmony has been achieved through a kind of sexual renunciation instigated by the female. This is why the Cupid-like figure is trying to pull her away. They've had an amicable separation, as it were, but Cupid is trying to draw her back into something, and she's been crowned by some kind of all-purpose virtue here for this act of renunciation. This painting of a Mars-like figure relates thematically to the imagery of the London paintings, although the title it's presently given, Man Held Back by Peace and Love, is incorrect. The image stages a conflict in which Mars is clearly being pulled in two directions. Eros draws him forward, not back, by his left hand, the bad hand, probably towards the couch of Venus, while an emaciated, wraith-like figure pulls him in the other direction by his right arm. This is more likely to be one of the martial gods of terror or discord or fury, Phobos, Deimos, Iris, that accompany Mars into battle. Finally, the motif of the bond literalizes or makes concrete the principles of conjunction through which Veronese connects figures. These principles are not manneristic formulas, but are saturated with social, psychological, and erotic implications. They invest his work with a metaphoric dimension, a legibility that is beyond textual illustration, and to which the procedures of iconography alone cannot do justice. Above all, they arise from Veronese's awareness of and response to the increasingly hermetic relationalities of late Titian. Veronese's strategies are not adequately described as imitation or appropriation of Titian. With regard to Titian, they are critical reworkings, even replacements or erasures, that are far more heedful of emerging Aristotelian canons. Titian had tried to negotiate the sale of mythological paintings to the Holy Roman Emperor in 1868, but it was Veronese, not Titian, who it seems succeeded in placing his works in Prague. Thank you. Sorry for going on.
Okay, we're going to take a short 10-minute break, all right? This is how it's